Namaste.
Namaste.
So so enough of talking in tongues. I chose this topic, nationalism versus patriotism, walking a thin line. And I decided not to talk about this the 4th of July weekend, and I really liked the gospel reading for today. And then I got to looking at next week, and I really nothing in those readings resonated with me, so I said, well, we'll just shift this week's gospel into next week, and we'll talk about nationalism versus patriotism, even though I hadn't planned on doing that. But it's always good to do that on the 4th of July, even though the 4th of July is not a particularly spiritual or religious holiday. Not that you would know it from what a lot of churches do. And I was particularly kind of pleased this year, for the first time that I've noticed it anyway on social media, to see people starting to challenge the fact that at the front of many of our churches are flags, American flags. You usually have the denomination flag in one corner and the American flag in the other, and the question becomes, why? I used to know somebody who was an Episcopal priest whose father was retired military and who objected to flags being flown basically virtually anywhere in a public space, because his understanding of the flying of the flag was that it was only flown over disputed territory. And while it was, in his mind, okay to fly one over a government building maybe, there were a lot of places like schools where they were flown outside as if they were under attack. Now, I think that's probably one extreme that I wouldn't go to. I think there's patriotic expressions of flag flying that are just fine. But it's interesting, always around the 4th of July, to see, and throughout the year really, to see these confusions about what is patriotism and what is nationalism. And you see what nationalism can do right now in Myanmar, which used to be Burma, where Buddhist monks, who are supposed to be nonviolent, that's been going on a long time, are actually, there's pictures from Myanmar of Buddhist monks in their robes carrying AK-47s. Yeah, which is so antithetical to that particular tradition that it's unbelievable, but it shows the power of nationalism. The power that says, and one of the ways I've always made the distinction is, patriotism says my country is a great place to be. Nationalism says my country right or wrong. And of course there's a problem when you start to defend, there's a potential problem, my country even when it's wrong. And I really enjoy, there's some videos going around on social media right now about that sort of flip different ethnic groups with what if, you know, these people acted like Caucasians did. And there's a great video of a guy jogging in a park who comes across a Korean woman who's been jogging in the park and starts telling her about how much he likes kimchi. And
funny how that works.
Yeah, how that works. And there's one I saw just yesterday for the first time, where a guy's walking down the street and another guy, and I had the video off, but there were captions. So there's like a white guy walking down the street and a Hispanic guy comes around the corner, and I don't know what the white guy said, but the Hispanic guy turns around and yells, "This is the United States, learn Spanish for crying out loud." You know, instead of learn English. And it's in that nationalism, there can be a desire for everybody to be the same, which always, when it's taken too far, leads to a desire to cleanse, which almost always leads to some kind of a genocidal push. Related to this, but kind of interesting, are some people who now find themselves caught in their own words. You know how sometimes people will be so sure something's going to turn out the way they think it's going to turn out. And so Rush Limbaugh said in 2010 that if Obamacare passed, he would leave the country in 5 years. And people are starting to point out that it's it's halfway through 2015 and he's still here. There's a pastor in Texas somewhere, I believe, who said that if the Supreme Court upheld gay marriage, he would set himself on fire. And he's not burning yet. And now, I don't know if you know who John Hagee is. He's a fundamentalist pastor, televangelist, and probably the most openly hate-filled one there is. And he's gained a lot of weight, and people who live in fat bodies shouldn't throw stones, but I want to say he looks like he's about to explode. And I realize I'm getting there myself. But he said that if God allowed the Supreme Court to uphold gay marriage, then God better apologize for Sodom and Gomorrah, in which there are two really huge problems. Who died and put him in charge of God, first. And the second problem is Sodom and Gomorrah, as everybody but a fundamentalist knows, is not about sexuality. Because it's not about sexual orientation. It could be, but it isn't, about the fact that Lot was willing to offer up his two daughters to be raped in order to protect the angels who were disguised as humans inside his house. It could be about the fact that God doesn't too much like the idea that a father would offer up his daughters to be raped. But it isn't really about that either. It's about hospitality. And hospitality was perhaps the number one value in the Old Testament. Because there weren't 7-Elevens, there weren't Holiday Inns, there weren't rest areas next to the interstate, much less interstates. And so to be a traveler was to be intensely vulnerable. And you traveled either by foot or on caravan, which really didn't go a whole lot faster than on foot, even if you were riding on the camels. And so even in the protection of a caravan, you were subject to attack by bandits and robbers. And you see that, not to get off topic too much, but in the story of the Good Samaritan where the guy was beaten by a robber, this kind of thing happened all the time. And so if somebody knocked on your door, or the flap of your tent, and said, I need a place to stay, the expectation was you would say yes. And as this third reading from the Unitarian Universalist website brings out and points out, nationalism is, first and foremost, a failure of hospitality. It says, you can only be here if I approve of you. And it doesn't matter really how vulnerable you are, which the value of hospitality was completely rooted in how vulnerable people were. But what matters is that you conform to my expectations. And there probably isn't anybody who's ever been a teenager, which includes almost everybody, or will, who hasn't understood the pain that happens when we don't meet people's expectations. Because that's what the whole clique thing is about, right? That's what the whole thing about you can sit at my lunch table is about. It's about, I have these expectations about what people who are cool enough to be with me, and even, the most uncool people in the world have the same expectations. So everybody has them. And they will decide whether you're worthy or not. And the spiritual question is, who isn't worthy? This is what the whole idea, and I don't necessarily accept all this theology anymore, but the whole idea of God's grace was that you didn't have to be worthy. No, I accept that part, but it gets extended into a whole lot of stuff. And people have such a hard time with that. I think it's what I want to call our lunch table theology. Okay, you're okay to be at my lunch table, you're not. Because the New Testament in particular says again and again, You don't earn acceptance from God. You're just accepted by God because. And that's what grace is. And then, however you view Jesus' crucifixion, death, and resurrection, there are people who want to turn around and say, well, but wait now, grace is for everybody except people who can't sit at my lunch table, right? And that was never what it was. And nationalism is an attempt to say, who is fit to sit at this lunch table we call our country, whatever it is. Now, lest we be confused, patriotism involves criticism of the status quo. And today a lot of people think that that's not patriotic. But in fact it is. It is very patriotic to say, I care about my country enough that I'm willing to criticize it when I think it is going in the wrong direction. And it's the nationalistic voice that wants to silence that. No, you can't say that. Who are you? If you don't like it, get out. And in the American context, it gets really, really difficult because there's this whole thing about freedom of speech. And freedom of speech is not about being free to say whatever you want to say as long as it doesn't make you uncomfortable. Freedom of speech is about freedom of speech. And so I always, not always, for some years, I've been particularly conflicted about 4th of July parades. And thank God I'm married to somebody who's not a big parade fan. Because I don't mind going. But I remember as a teenager thinking, okay, how many times do we have to get up and down? Because just about everything that comes by has a flag in front. And these were the days when there was definitely that concrete expectation, man, you will stand up. And I have no problem whatsoever standing up when there's a group of soldiers or veterans or with a flag. No problem at all. But do I really have to rise for every high school marching band? This would become the question, And even though I'm at the age now where I kind of get a pass on that one, at least where I'm in the physical shape where I could get a pass on that one. I could hang my handicap parking thing from the bow of my glasses.
That would be cute.
That would be, it's a nice look. Which reminds me of a story I'll have to tell you sometime. But really, when you descend into a legalism around that, like here comes the flock of Harleys in a parade that all have flags on them. And it becomes an up, down, up, down, up, down. And there's this pressure to conform, and if you don't, there's a problem. That's falling into nationalism. That's falling into whatever the reason is, you can't deviate from what's expected. You're not wearing the cool jeans at our middle school lunch table. You're going to have to go. And generally speaking, anytime there's a narrowing of what's considered allowable or acceptable practice, it's a huge spiritual problem. Because what it leads to are monks in Myanmar carrying automatic weapons because we can't let those dirty Muslims into our ethnically pure Theravadan Buddhist country. And that is hugely problematic. It says that when expectations narrow, I have to throw away my values that aren't going to fit this new narrowed set of expectations. So my value is nonviolence, I have to throw it away because the most important thing is conforming. And I'm afraid that in this country, in particular, and I'm sure in others, but I don't know because I don't live there, patriotism is becoming a narrower and narrower place. Now, there certainly have been times where protests have crossed the line. There's certainly, we can point to, for example, returning Vietnam veterans who were horribly mistreated in this country by people who were opposed to the war but couldn't separate the war from these people and couldn't get to the point where they said, if I'm going to spit on anybody, I'm going to spit on Tricky Dick or LBJ or some political official who's promoting this, not the people who are the victims of the system. And And so even free speech, when it's exercised without thought and without compassion and without hospitality, becomes really, really problematic. But that doesn't mean you throw it away. We see it in how freedom of religion is interpreted today. Freedom of religion means, to a lot of people, I get to practice my religious beliefs, and you get to practice my religious beliefs too. And then everything will be fine. But that's not what that means. And so, I think within this patriotism and nationalism divide, if you will, there's huge lessons that can be drawn from the spiritual life, even without going into patriotism and nationalism. It's that broad is better than narrow. It's that challenging the status quo, as long as it doesn't harm anybody directly, is always a good thing. That it isn't political correctness to stand up for somebody who's oppressed or marginalized. And with those 3 examples and more that exist today, when we state our positions and try and share with others how we feel, if we start making promises that we know we're not going to deliver on, ultimately we destroy our credibility. Unless, Rush Limbaugh is ready to apply for immigration to another country, or Hagee can prove that he's been put in charge of the world, or the pastor in Dallas starts smoking, nobody's going to take him seriously anymore. Not that in some of those folks' cases, a whole lot of people have taken him seriously for a while. But not only is that the danger, but it doesn't help the discussion. Saying wild stuff, like if I believe enough, I can fly out of this window over to the roof of that building over there, doesn't advance any discussion, in addition to making me look like more of a fool than I really am. So, maybe it's a question of hospitality. Maybe it's a question of realizing that we can make everybody feel welcome without having to invite them to move into our spare bedroom. That there are shades of difference. And we can learn to exist not at the black and the white extremes, but in the middle. And also that it's a process, and we come to that place slowly, step by step, incident by incident, if you will, person we meet by person we meet. And it's okay to allow ourselves to be in the middle and be unfolding yet, and be moving towards our goal yet, and for that goal to be fluid. But can we do that for everybody else as well?